Everyone, Erin Whitmer here. I have a message that I want to share with you today. You might not be familiar with my personal testimony or my personal story. I will be sharing a link on my fan page that links to a radio program that I was featured on a couple of days ago, and it's called Christian Devotion Speak Up. And it's a really incredible program for Christians to be able to come on and share their testimony with other people about how God has really shown up for them and their lives. So he asked me really interesting questions about my childhood, about how I was raised, about how I met my husband, about, just all of those things that I'd kind of really just dismissed about my life. Now, I'm writing a book right now about my testimony, and so a lot of that is in my book, and so it's not that I don't necessarily think it's important. But I thought, gosh, this is a radio program about my testimony. How interesting that he's asking me questions about how I was raised and what it was like, and being a Navy brat, my father being on a submarine, and how did I meet my husband, and little known fact that I actually dated his brother for a couple of times before Mike and I got together. Isn't that funny? I know, my husband loves to tell that story. He calls me a Whitmer groupie. It's a little embarrassing, but it's pretty a nice little fun factoid, lighten up the mood a little bit. So he was asking me just all of these questions, and then I realized, my story begins so way before I thought that it began. If you don't know my testimony, you might not know that my son, at 20 weeks and 2 days, why I still went by the gestational age when he was an infant, so basically that's 4.5 months old. My son was shaken by his daycare provider, and he nearly died. And it's funny, all these years later, it will be 8 years in April. All these years later, sometimes that emotion comes out, and you think you're healed, and you think you've moved on, and you think, I've moved cities, I've moved houses, I've shared my story, I've written about it, I know my story, I'm comfortable with my story, but sometimes you think, gosh, that still hurts. And maybe you've kind of been in that situation yourself, where there's something in your past or there's something in your life and you think you've moved past it, and then you just take a moment and you share it because it's important to share, and then you think, oh, that hurts. It still hurts. So I understand that. Clearly, sometimes it still hurts for me too. And so even just doing this interview, I was just thinking about my story and how I really thought that story began on a Monday afternoon in April, when my son was shaken, when my son nearly died, and when I really just kind of fell into a foxhole, just so terrified. I had no faith. I had no faith back then. I had thought that I had known God in the past and thought, hey, he's kind of cool. I could be into him. But then at some point, I was like, you know what? Actually, partying is way more fun. Yeah, partying is totally more fun. And boys, yes, I like boys. I like them more than God right now. And that's really where I was. I was really just broken and lost, and not that different from a lot of people that you might know, a lot of people who I know, maybe even like you, who knows. But I really thought that was when my story began. That was when I was broken, and I was broken for God. I didn't know it then, but I was. So I realized that my story started so much earlier than I thought that it had started. I can trace parts of my story back all through those crazy years when I was completely rebellious and turned away from God. That's a part of my story. And it's a part of my story that's important. I can go back to my childhood and the fact that I was not raised by a believer, that both my parents had really left their childhood faith behind, and they didn't know what to do with it, and they didn't know if it had any value, and they didn't know whether it would belong in my life. God knew it would belong in my life, and he knew it was going to be central to my life. And so the fact that I wasn't raised with any sort of faith, that's part of my story too, and it's important. So here's what I want to help you understand. Don't give in to the lie. Don't believe the lie that you hear in your head, that maybe you tell yourself over and over again, that there is no value in your past. Because your past is valuable. It's incredibly valuable. And more than that, your past is powerful. Your past is powerful to your testimony. You might not know your testimony yet. You might not know where your story is going, but everywhere you've been is powerful, and it's got value, and it has a point. You just don't know which direction that point is going. So that's the first thing that I want to share with you today. The second thing I want you to think about is, when did your story begin? Do you feel like your story began on the worst day of your life? Or maybe you feel like your story began on the best day of your life, when you got married, when your first child was born. I know for me, I really felt like life began the day that my son Noah, was born, which is why, of course, everything came crashing down so terribly when he was injured and when we nearly lost him. And so if you're a parent, you understand that. If you're not a parent, you've had moments in your life that maybe have tested you, and you've thought, gosh, is this the beginning of my story, or is it the end of my story? Because sometimes in those terrible, terrible moments of life, we think, this is it. This is all I've got. This is it. It's the end. And I remember when Noah was shaken, I remember being in the hospital. I remember being just curled up so tight. And I remember thinking, there will never be joy. This is the end. This is the end of my life. This is the end of everything. And we weren't sure whether my son would survive. We weren't sure whether my son would grow. We weren't sure whether he would thrive. And we just gave it all to God, and we said, dear God, please save our son. Please save him. We had nothing else to do, right? There was no other choice. We either pray to God or we take a chance. On what? On my son dying? On us losing everything? What I know now is that even if we'd lost him, God would have redeemed us, and God would have redeemed our life. But God found a way to redeem our life and to redeem our story without taking my son. And that might not be true for you. Maybe you've lost a child. And I know people who have lost children, and I've been close to that, so I'm sensitive to it, but I haven't felt the loss that you've felt. Each of our losses that we have, they're all so unique. I joke sometimes that I'm a Starbucks junkie. I'm just gonna let the cat out of the bag right now. I love me some Starbucks. And so sometimes I think that our stories in our life are just as unique as our Starbucks orders. You know, whether you want a grande, extra hot, no whip, caramel, macchiato, whatever. I don't even know how to order them the right way. I mess that up all the time too, but that's just part of my story. But we're all so different. And yes, I'm making light of something that's very serious and very heavy on some of our hearts, but all of our stories are different. But no matter what, our past, where we've come from, there's value in that. There's such incredible value in that. And I just pray that you will give that to God, and He will show you where to go with that. So I want to give you kind of a tangible example of what I mean by our story not beginning where we think it begins. So let's think about Jesus. Everybody knows who Jesus is. Even if you're not in love with Jesus like I am, even if you don't know him as intimately as I do, you know enough about Jesus that he was born on December 25th, right? And you know that Christmas is all about Jesus. 'Tis the reason for the season. Not all Americans celebrate Christmas in that way because it has shifted and changed over the years. But here's the thing. And think about this for a second. Do you think that the story of Jesus began the day that he was born? When he was sweet little baby Jesus. Everybody loves to talk about baby Jesus, right? Sweet little baby Jesus. Do you think the story began that day when he was like this 6-ounce little screaming bundle of joy, Emmanuel, God with us? Do you think that's the beginning of the story? If you spend enough time in the Bible, if you spend enough time studying the scriptures, and I am not proclaiming to be an expert in scripture, there is so much that I have to learn, and it's definitely one of those things where you spend a little time in it and you're like, oh man, I so don't know anything. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know. But here's what I do know. Christmas Day, the birth of Jesus, even when Mary became pregnant with Jesus, that wasn't the beginning of the story. You could say that the beginning of the story was with Abraham, even though I don't think that was the beginning of the story. And like I said, I'm not a biblical scholar. In Genesis, what chapter is it? I got to look it up over here. Genesis 22:17. I'm going to grab my Bible so that I can read this to you because I just love this. And I love the story of Abraham. And this is the story in the Old Testament in Genesis when God has told Abraham to take his son Isaac and to go take him and he's going to be a sacrifice. Can you imagine that? You know, here I am talking about nearly losing my child and what it did to my life and how that story has impacted my life and people around me. And then you think, God says to this man, take this child, who this man worked really hard to get, by the way. This boy was a miracle. He said, take your miracle, bring him up, put some wood up there, lay him out, and let him be a sacrifice to me. Awful. I don't think I could have done that. But what he does right before Abraham is ready to make his son a sacrifice, God says, stop, wait, okay. You're good. We're good. You've proven to me that you are loyal. But what he says next is a promise. And this is where the story can really begin. And notice this, by the way. This story comes out of pain, right? Imagine the emotional anguish that Abraham has as a father walking up that mountain. And his son was, asking him, well, where's the sacrifice? We're going to go make a sacrifice. Where is it? And Abraham says, God will provide the sacrifice. So think about the pain that this father was dealing with, all this journey up there. So his story for him might have felt like he might have thought, this is the end. This is the end of my story. But this is the beginning of a bigger, most amazing story. So let me read to you what he says. This is God speaking to him. He says, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. We know that he's talking about all of us being saved. In Isaiah 49:53, we get the prophecy of Jesus in that book as well. So Jesus is all over in the Old Testament. He's everywhere. And yet we think that his story began when he was born on Christmas Day. It wasn't the beginning. It was just the beginning of the story as we knew it. But here's the thing. Our story began way before any of us are even aware that we're in the middle of something great. How many people know they're in a story? When my son was shaken on that Monday, I didn't know what was happening. I didn't even know he'd been shaken. I thought he had choked on milk. I didn't know that there was a homicide detective there that day because my son was so close to death. They were afraid that he would die. And there was a child abuse investigation and there was a homicide detective there. I didn't know that. I was in the middle of a story that was so much bigger than I could have imagined. And yet that story was even bigger than I thought that it could be. Because God was at the center of it, and God's redemption is at the center of it. And that's something that I'm writing about in my book. And I hope someday that I'll be able to share this book with you, that I'll be able to find a publisher who will have the heart to share this story about how even when we are just absolutely faithless, I had no faith, none whatsoever, God still redeems the faithless because he is always faithful. How amazing is that to know? So let me ask you this. When did your story begin? Did it begin before your sadness, or did it begin after? Did it begin before your tragedy, or after? Did it begin when you thought everything was ending, or maybe did it begin long, long, long before that? I want to share something with you. It's just a couple of sentences out of the book that I've been writing, but it's something that I discovered in my writing about where my story began. Because like I said, I thought it started on that Monday, and then I realized in writing, and when I had that interview, that it started way, way, way before that. But then here's what I really found out, and what I discovered, and what I think is going to be true for you too, because I believe that it's a truth for all of us. When my mother stroked my newborn cheek, this perfect love understood in her life for the first time. Her fingers touched the skin of a baby God had already doted on, made plans for, created as a masterpiece to do great things in His name. And it is the same for you, whether you know this to be true or not. So for all of us, no matter where we are in our story, no matter whether we know our story has begun or whether we feel like it's already at the end, I can promise you, your story began before you even knew. And your story began with a God who loves you and who created you and who has incredible, incredible plans for you. And I'm so honored to be able to share that word with you. And I'm so thankful for you taking the time to listen to this. If you like what you've heard, if you've been inspired at all, I encourage you to check out my website, which is erinwhitmer.com. I've got the little details down there at the bottom of the screen. So again, that's erinwhitmer.com, and you can subscribe to my newsletter, and I'll send my blog to you, plus some other free goodies, including a devotional that I've written as well. Thank you so much for spending time with me and for blessing me just with you even listening to my story and my heart. Thanks.